Well, good evening, and welcome back to our second session of the MFI Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Beckwith. This is my co-host, Alana Stubblebine, and we are coming to you once again live tonight from a secure underground studio just outside of Boston. And I want to thank our sponsors at What TV, whose studio this is, for hosting the event. They have a ton of pro-family content, news, and entertainment that you can find on their website at whattv.org, or you can download their app and stream it directly from there. Mike King will put it in the chat so you can find the link easily. We're studying again Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies. We have 8 panelists we'll be talking with tonight, and close to 200 people signed up to watch via Zoom. Now make sure to put your comments in the chat and ask your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom app. I will try to do better than last Tuesday to get to those questions as we go along. Last week, we heard from former Soviet emigres, as well as experts in the law, higher education, and big tech. And they all shared on the same theme that we as Christians are facing what is effectively a rival religion in progressivism. And it has taken over almost all of our institutions in this country: the media, schools, state houses, big corporations, and even some churches. And it's the church and the family that are the only 2 institutions we have left. So that's why we see progressivism attacking them aggressively now. Now, speaking of which, since last week, we've learned that despite entering phase 4 of the Massachusetts COVID-19 reopening plan, not only are churches still capped at 50% capacity for attendance on Sunday mornings by the governor's orders, some local cities here in the Commonwealth are limiting attendance to less than 15%. That's 1/5. Students in Wellesley, Massachusetts are being sorted into racial affinity groups in which white children are not allowed. And a public school teacher has been put on administrative leave because one of her students, a 12-year-old, is transitioning from girl to boy. But the reason the teacher is being disciplined is not because she was promoting transgenderism. On the contrary, the teacher is accused of telling the girl's parents that it was happening, something the school wanted to hide from the parents because the student asked them to. Now, as disturbing as that is, you can't just say it's Massachusetts where the public schools and local governments are notoriously progressive, because what we're learning now about this 12-year-old girl is that starting in the 2nd grade, she was fed a steady diet of LGBTQ propaganda, not by her teachers, but by the YouTube suggestions that popped up automatically when she logged into her Google-based school account. She said she's a bit of a tomboy, and so as we discussed last week with the way that these technology giants track everything we do online, it is entirely possible that Google's algorithms have taken the content of her school emails, hangouts, web searches, and docs, where she writes about tomboy stuff, and decided, no, you're not a tomboy, you're actually a trans boy. And she's become convinced of that. As she described, the content of these YouTube videos pushing transgenderism, quote, slowly faded into me. And that sort of insidious indoctrination of our children by the omnipresent tentacles of big tech is happening all over the country. I have no doubt it's just as bad in Wichita as it is in Wellesley. Now, at MFI, we're working to address those immediate local problems I just mentioned, and I offer them as a timely follow-up to the warnings we heard last week. But tonight, however, we want to mix in some signs of hope. In Dreher's book, the first part is some pretty rough sledding, but the second half helps us think through what we can do now to foster communities, churches, schools, and families that are committed to living in truth. Once again, we've invited panelists who are doing just that, and I'm especially delighted to be introducing you a bit later to a number of young men and women who have survived growing up in the last 2 decades with their faith and values intact. They're going to share in part what it is their families did to help them successfully navigate this brave new world. But first, I want to talk about chapter 5, value nothing more than truth. I know you like this chapter, Alana. There's a quote on page 99, if you've got the book. I think it's a quote from Havel. This is the Polish dissident, but he says, the lie can constitute the system only if it is universal. The principle must embrace and permeate everything. There are no terms whatsoever on which it can coexist with living within the truth. And therefore, everyone who steps out of line denies it in principle and threatens it in its entirety. And I know we faced this in 2018 when we had the bathroom bill repeal. This was where the LGBT agenda was pushing adding gender identity to our nation's, or sorry, the Commonwealth's public accommodations laws. What that meant is that biological men could use women's bathrooms, locker rooms, shower facilities, homeless shelters, things like that. And the reason they pushed so hard for that is because to even have one area kind of at the extremes where there's a firewall of reality to this illusion of transgenderism, that would undo the whole thing. In other words, we can't just say, all right, Bruce Jenner, he calls himself Caitlyn now, fine, whatever you want to do. But look, no, you can't go into the women's locker room. If we're allowed to do that, the whole thing comes unraveled. And they recognize that, which is why they push so hard, ultimately successfully, to keep that law, that new law on the books. You were talking earlier about the greengrocer.
Yes, chapter 5 is my favorite chapter in the entire book. In fact, I think I'm going to have T-shirts made up that say value nothing more than truth. But the first story on page 97, I'm just going to read a section about the greengrocer because I think it is so powerful and applicable for today. Consider, he said, the case of the greengrocer who posts a sign in his shop bearing the well-known slogan from the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe in it. He hangs it in his shop as a signal of his own conformity. He just wants to be left alone. His action is not meaningless, though. The Greengrocers Act not only confirms that this is what is expected of one in a communist society, but it also perpetuates the belief that this is what it's meant to be a good citizen. My husband and I were recently walking this weekend in Walden Pond, and I got yelled at for pulling my mask down. And my husband came over and said, "Don't you know what it means to be a good citizen?" And it's just funny, but it's where we're at right now. But now let us imagine, it says on 98, let us imagine that one day something in our greengrocer snaps and he stops putting up the slogans merely to ingratiate himself. That costs him. He loses his shop. His salary is cut. He won't be able to travel abroad. Maybe his children won't be able to get into college. I can relate to that. People persecute him and those around him, not necessarily because they oppose his stance, but because they know that this is what they will have to do to keep the authorities off of their back. And if you think of how many things this year we have had to conform to, I mean, I think back to June when everybody was posting these black squares, and if you didn't post, silence is violence. And the pressure, especially as a Christian leader, people in the churches, that they were pressuring pastors to post this square, and they were doing it, even though it goes against everything we believe. So there's just a lot of conformity, I think, happening right now, just to be left alone.
And then that touches on the other point you mentioned of doublethink, which I think comes from the book 1984, and this idea of what do they say there? Peace is violence, or one of the quotes from 1984. But we kind of saw that this past summer with the mostly peaceful protests, where almost literally on the news you'd see images of stores burning, and reporters telling you it's a peaceful protest,
right?
Regardless of the ideological merits of what's being protested, clearly not peaceful.
Right.
And yet being forced to kind of swallow that lie. And as I mentioned last week, individuals potentially losing their job if they didn't use the preferred pronouns, which again is a lie.
Yeah. On the next page as well, it says there's a quote from a Russian Orthodox mystic, and he says, "Acquire the Holy Spirit, and thousands around you will be saved." In that sense, what the greengrocer has done is a small act of rebellion that may act as a spark of a revolution that saves liberty and saves humanity. I mean, if you think about it, the Holy Spirit acts as a spirit of truth. Okay, so one act of truth, standing up for truth and not doing something because we're standing for truth, could spark just what we need, which is this liberty, a revolution.
And that's why for so many people, these lies that they feel forced to conform to, even though they may not be hurting anyone, if we worship a God who is truth incarnate, then speaking a lie not only is a violation of the commandments, but is a denial of that God. So there's some severe conscience violations that can take place with all this. That unfortunately a lot, in the media and even the courts don't fully understand, but we as people of faith do. Speaking of people of faith, I want to bring in our first guest today. He is the founder of Massachusetts Family Institute and currently the vice chair. He's an entrepreneur, a man of the church. He's a combat veteran. Rob Bradley. Are you there, Rob?
Yes, indeed. Hi, Andrew.
All right, good. Well, thanks for coming on. I wanted to read you a quote from page 112. This is now in chapter 6, Cultivating Cultural Memory. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because, I've heard you speak, whether you spoke at my class when I taught at Gordon years ago, and other times. And to me, you kind of embody cultural memory for our country and for our faith. So I want to have you kind of share some of that with our audience tonight, as you did in the past, whether it's from my Gordon class or elsewhere. But the quote on page 112, this is about the Victims of Communism Memorial Fund, which carried out a survey of Americans to determine their attitudes toward communism, socialism, and Marxism in general. In 2019, the survey found that a startling number of Americans of the post-Cold War generations have favorable views of left-wing radicalism, and only 50% of millennials believe that the Declaration of Independence offers a better guarantee of freedom and equality than the Communist Manifesto. The study's findings are that our schools and colleges have romanticized the ideology of communism and taught a one-dimensional, sanitized narrative of it. Dreher says to combat this by creating small fortresses of memory. Now, I know you faced communism up close and personal in Vietnam. So I'm sure you're aware of this, that the younger generation who didn't grow up to witness the fall of the Berlin Wall and things like that they don't understand, what this is about, what communism actually has done throughout the 20th century. Do you agree with that assessment by Dreher? And what can we do to create small fortresses of memory, as he puts it?
Yeah, Andrew, thank you very much for having me on. Not only was I in Vietnam on a swift boat, but when we lived, Nancy and I and our family lived in Europe, and we actually went behind the Iron Curtain in the 70s to East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So we saw communism up front and personal. And also being a history student, I know, as an example, which so few people do, that Mao Zedong, when he did the Great Leap Forward, 40 million Chinese died. And when Stalin did the collectivization of the kulaks in 1930s in Russia, 8 to 10 million people were either liquidated or sent to the gulags. So the fact that in America, the academy, by that I mean the high schools and colleges and universities, can be teaching that communism and socialism is as good or better than democratic capitalism is just appalling. It's really terrible. And I just point out on page 111, George Orwell's quote, which is so important: who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. And we're really seeing that in spades right now, where the woke mob is controlling the present, controlling the past, and with that, able to control the future. So, as you mentioned, I think the single most important sort of small fortress that can change things is the family.
Right.
And there's no question in my mind that. And so I don't know if I can give a couple of things that we do in the family, but I don't want to keep on talking too long, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I'd like to hear some of those. This is...
Please, I'm taking notes.
Right. And we're going to have, like I said, students on later to hear from their perspective what parents did.
Sure.
Share with us some of those practices that you've done with your family.
Yeah, one of the things I would say is that we have many conservative friends who have lost their children, who somehow their children are not conservative and even not Christian. And, it's very hard for Nancy and I to understand that, because in our family, as an example, on Thanksgiving, every Thanksgiving, our children and now our grandchildren, we sit down as a family and we pass around the founding documents. So when the Puritans came over in 1620, we actually read the original about them coming across the Atlantic and landing and thanking God. We also read Washington's proclamation for Thanksgiving and his wonderful thanking God for the country, and Lincoln's. And when we do that, every year, it creates a cultural memory for everybody. And that's the type of thing that we do. We also, at the family dinner table, it's such an important thing. And we always ate together. And we really did two things. One is we read books. After the meal was over, we would take a book like Johnny Tremain or Tom Sawyer or the Chronicles of Narnia, and we would pass it around so everybody had a chance to read it. And it created a cultural and historical memory, which was so important. And just one quick comment. When the Berlin Wall went down in November 1989, our kids were 10 and 13 and 15, and they understood what it was like, that we never thought we'd ever see this again, and that indeed the champagne was broken out because of a great historical thing.
Yeah, I can remember that coming down as well, and that the younger generations weren't there to see that or to know what happened before. And it's interesting you mentioned, Rob, reading books to your children, particularly C.S. Lewis. I know my dad read me all the C.S. Lewis books when I was young, and those had a big, effect on sort of my worldview and my spirituality. Interestingly, in Dreher's book, I think in the next chapter, he talks about a family, the Benda family. I think they were within Poland, but under the Soviet rule. And he kind of lists 6 different things that the Benda family did with their children that kind of did the same thing. And one of them was reading. The mom, even while the dad was in prison, the mom would read 2 hours a night, oftentimes out of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series. And they credited that in part for filling their moral imagination with the good, which I think is an important thing. I try to do that with my kids as well. So you've done some important things with your family, Rob, but you've also helped a lot of other families by, I think as Dreher says in one of his other chapters, helping create a parallel polis, or as you said, parallel institutions of excellence. We kind of lament how so many of our institutions have given up their heritage or been taken over by the progressives. So you've started some new ones. Can you tell us about some of that work that you've done?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. The after about 10 or 15 years of living in Boston, it became clear to me that it was going to be impossible to reform the academy and many of the large institutions in Massachusetts and Boston, and that we needed to create parallel structures of excellence. And so one of the first ones that we did largely through Park Street Church, but also Roberto, Miranda, who's going to speak later, and others, we started Boston Trinity Academy, a school built on the rock of Jesus Christ with academic excellence, and also, an outreach to the community. So 65% of the kids come from minority families. We wanted to create a school, among other things, which would create every year 40 or 50 students who ultimately could be leaders in the Boston area, hopefully. So that's just one example of the type of institution. Another, of course, was Massachusetts Family Institute, because the family is ultimately the critical institution in the society. And I think, as Michael Novak or Bill Bennett said, the first and most important department of health, education, and welfare. So creating a really outstanding organization, which you're now leading so well, was another one. There are other, schools that I know our board member, John DiMatteo, and his wife have started. St. Benedict Classical Academy in Natick. It's a Catholic elementary school, a school of great excellence. And then finally, more recently, 4 or 5 years ago, we started an alternative and actually a news site with a Christian worldview and a conservative worldview, New Boston Post, to try to really get the truth out. So, I just encourage all of us, we have that responsibility to begin to create other great institutions which can rival and ultimately overtake these other corrupt institutions.
One of the other things that we did is we made sure once our kids hit 3rd or 4th grade, they were coming to the MFI banquet with us, because you have these incredible speakers, and we wanted them there. They would have a notebook. We made them take notes. Even though it's an adult event, we wanted them there sitting in the front taking notes, because they're such good speakers speaking truth.
I just would close, Andrew, by saying, I know you many other speakers, but that a society that hates itself, that believes its founding values are evil, can't continue long. We're in deep trouble now when we have a elite, the woke mob, the cancel culture, basically taking apart the great narrative of American history. And what I do at Boston Trinity Academy, almost every graduation ceremony, is tell everybody there, all the students and their families, 60 million immigrants have come legally to America in the last 60 years, because it's a beacon of hope, a land of opportunity, and despite all our imperfections, is a place where people see they're a beacon of hope. So do not despair, and tell that story and get the history out is what I try to do,
Yeah, that's so important, Robert. We still have the freedom to do that right now.
I think what he said about history is a huge piece of it. In fact, in the book, they talk about history. On page 101, it says, Father Cahill, it says that when I was a teenager, I wanted to study history, he says, but my father explained to me that in the Soviet world, trying to be involved with history and not being involved with Soviet ideology is impossible. So I became a geologist. And so, we have this erasing of history. It's unbelievable what's happening.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say is maybe I was too zealous about it, because we have 3 children. One went to Dartmouth, one to Williams, one at Gordon. They all 3 majored in history.
Wow. Did they make it out alive?
They did. They did.
Very good. Well, thanks, Rob. And one other point, if you can stay with us for just a minute, because I know when you started MFI, and probably the same with Boston Trinity Academy, you saw the importance of what I think I've heard referred to as the ecumenicism of the trenches, or as Dreher refers to in his book, the solidarity of the shattered. It's not quite that bad for us, but this idea that, look, Christians of all different denominations, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, we're all in this together when it comes to these sort of foundational beliefs about humanity, marriage, things like that. And so you were very intentional when you founded MFI that it was going to be an organization that had some authentic interdenominational broad Christian support.
Yeah, I'll just mention briefly, when we started in 1991, 92, I met with at Focus on the Family with many of the other directors. And at that time, every single one of the family policy councils was entirely evangelical. And as I was flying back to Boston, I was thinking, Massachusetts is more than 50%, Catholic or Catholic culture. And how can we ever be successful if we don't bring our brothers and sisters in Christ through the Catholic Church involved? So from the very beginning, as you know, we've had Catholic board members, very, very close alliance with Catholic organizations. So, that's so important. And at Boston Trinity Academy, for example, many of the teachers are Catholic or Orthodox Christians, and it works wonderfully when you're in the trenches together trying to fight against the woke mob,
That's right. Yeah.
I think the Bradleys are a real example of what Dreher talks about when he says, see, judge, act. In so many things, they saw a problem, they judged, and then they took action. All different kinds of action.
That's true. Well, thanks for joining us, Rob.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, next, I want to move on to some of these young college students that I'm excited to introduce you to. I believe we have 4 or 5 who are on with us from Gordon College and 2 from Liberty University. Let's go ahead and start with Liam Ziegler, if he's there. Liam is intern for MFI. He was a sophomore or junior now at Gordon?
I'm a sophomore, yeah.
Sophomore, all right. And you also recently started, similar to Rob Bradley, saw a need for sort of parallel institution. And so you started a new online newspaper for Gordon, the Gordon Review.
Yeah, I did. That was a project that that I thought of late fall, and I got a lot of people together. We started it up. We ran our first edition beginning of February, and it's been going pretty well. Kind of as like what you're saying, if you can't reform an institution, you create a new one, and that was kind of the situation at Gordon College. It's like very complex, but that was pretty much what happened.
Well, I'm so glad that you did it. It was great to see on that first issue a lot of very strong pro-life articles. I think it was right around the time of the March for Life. So tell us a little bit about, what does your family do? And full disclosure, your mom is Mary Ellen Ziegler, who works for MFI and does a fantastic job. What did she and your dad do, bringing up you and your 2 siblings, that you think helped sort of keep you in the faith and maintain this sort of worldview of the truth, as we've been discussing?
Yeah, I would probably say the 2 biggest things well, first of all, the biggest one was in making sure and emphasizing character development and character growth. And the second, I would say, is also emphasizing the need for intellectual maturity and for intellectual inquiry. I'll just talk about the first. My parents have always, from the moment that they took me out of Christian school, have been very focused on asking the questions, how can we cultivate Christ-like values in myself and my siblings? And they haven't done it in a way that I felt like it's been like forced down my throat, in a way that if I disagree with a certain point or certain interpretation of scripture, that I'm like immediately like, I don't know, judged or contradicted. But they definitely helped me grow my faith as I'm discovering it for myself, and in a way that left a lot of doors open for me to ask questions. Like I remember talking to my dad all the time about theology, like 14, 15, 16. I would ask him all these questions about like Calvinism, Arminianism, like about how the scripture verse relates to this issue, and et cetera, and just them being there and helping me walk through that process definitely helped. And then the second one, it really ties into that, just creating an environment for me to think better, to think reasonably and responsibly. My parents have never been the ones to say, okay, don't read from that thinker or that person, but they've always challenged me to like take what they're saying and to understand it and to reason with it in light of scripture. And we've always been able to talk about those things. And I think one thing that is very important for me is that there wasn't really a closed-minded pursuit. They've always encouraged me to understand your opponent's arguments as if you can argue them yourself, as if you believe them. So you're better able to process it within a Christian worldview, within a Christian understanding. And especially like my parents, like we had lots of conversations about it, like me going to Gordon College, which is definitely more like politically and theologically diverse school. Like we discussed lots of different issues in light of this context of me being here, and just talking about all the issues from just with the mutual acknowledgement that like we might not agree with everything, but we're doing it with a commitment to scripture and to the truth and to cultivating that Christian character. And ultimately, I think it was like them imparting in me that the concept that really what matters is that we're glorifying God through our pursuits, through our intellectual pursuits, through how we approach culture in the world. That really grounded me and kept me focused, even if I don't agree with them on absolutely everything.
So it's true. As a parent, you can't. Thank you, Liam. There's a lot of things you just can't hide from that you have to discuss, even if it's uncomfortable and you don't want to. And that's how you kind of walk your kids through these tough issues, so they're prepared. Because if the first time they're encountering some of these radical social agendas is on their own at college, that doesn't necessarily end well. Going back to the Benda family, which you mentioned earlier, there are, I think, 6 things that they talked about, or Dreher sort of outlines, that the Benda family did. And I asked several of our students specifically about those things. They modeled moral courage, is the Benda family. They filled their children's moral imagination with the good. That was sort of reading for 2 hours a night from Tolkien and elsewhere. They taught them not to be afraid to be weird in society's eyes. This is, I think, starting at page 136, if you're following along. Prepare them to make great sacrifices for the greater good. Teach them that they're part of a wider movement, and practice hospitality and serve others. Now, when I sort of reached out to some of these other students and asked them what did their family do that was similar to what the Bendas did, interestingly, the one that jumped out the most consistently was do not be afraid to be weird in society's eyes. That's one of the things you mentioned, Thomas. If you're on, I'd like to ask you a few questions now. Thomas Friedrich is a student at Gordon College as well.
Yeah, hello.
Thanks for joining us. When we chatted, you said that your folks told you not to worry about being weird, never pushed you to be popular, raised you and your siblings with the value that what the world thinks of you isn't important.
Yeah.
You kind of
I love that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I say the same thing to my
That's great.
kids. We're Christians. We're just going to be different. Get used to it.
Yeah.
How did your parents communicate that vibe to you?
Yeah, so no, that was a pretty common theme basically throughout my entire life, even when we're starting pretty young. I, for the bulk of my life, went to public school. And so that meant that I was, of course, exposed to a lot of people who weren't of the faith or who weren't of similar upbringing to me and this, that, and the other. And so really from the outset, it was my parents made sure that they knew that it wasn't important to them for me to be the most popular person in school, to have the most friends, to be the most athletic or best looking or anything like that or the other. They more just made sure that I knew that it was far more valuable to pursue the truth in what I believe, both in regards to my faith and outside of that. And then also just to live according to just fulfillment, not of the world, pursuing things that I want more than pursuing things that my peers wanted of me, and then of course pursuing the things that God wants more than the things that I want. And so it was a lot of things of just that me and my siblings, we didn't really strive for popularity. I wasn't anything of I didn't go to parties. I wasn't dating around or anything like that. I didn't have a cell phone until freshman year of high school, and didn't get an iPhone until a year or two after that.
That's interesting. And just want to stop you right there on the iPhone, the smartphone issue. Is that something that sets you apart, not getting a smartphone until you were a freshman in high school?
Certainly. Yeah. I can't think of any of my friends that got a cell phone after I did. I was definitely a late comer to, I guess that, and then social media on top of that. And it did set me out, and it was something that people would poke and make fun of at times, but I just didn't need a cell phone, I guess. And I didn't feel the need to have one to fit in, and didn't need to impress anyone by having the fanciest new technology. So.
And that's something that's I think especially challenging for us as parents, because it's so new. We don't have a model to sort of look back at. I mean, I'll say to my kids, you can get, a smartphone the same age I did, 30 or something, something along the lines, because they didn't have them before that, obviously. And so we really have no idea what it's like to as a teenager to have a smartphone. Mm-hmm. I can imagine. And, not a lot of good oftentimes, especially if it's not properly monitored or filtered. But this radical change of technology, as well as the change in social values, the exponential growth and change in technology, as well, as a tremendous challenge. How do you guys wrestle with that, Alana?
Oh,
because your girls are very good on social media, and they love cameras and stuff like that.
So girls they kind of like social media a lot. Yeah. I'm the wrong person to ask. There are definitely posts that I said, you need to take that down right now, because that doesn't glorify the Lord. So I was strict with them. Certain things they weren't allowed to follow or whatever. I monitored it. Oh, yeah. And I saw every text that came in.
Yeah.
I didn't just give it to them and then send them off. I saw everything.
Yeah. And you have to. It takes a lot of work. Thanks, Thomas, for that. And I will note you are a global honors student at Gordon. Dr. Barker's watching. I wanted me to point that out. He's proud of you guys. You have a fellow global honors student on here, Gabby Maston. Gabby, speaking of parents monitoring social media, do you want to share with us what you shared with me? Not to put you on the spot, but I thought that was an important story.
Yes, thanks for having me. So my parents were really strict with me in technology. And I didn't get my first phone until 6th grade. I didn't get a phone with internet until my freshman year of high school. Kind of backstory to what happened was I didn't really fit in middle school. So coming into high school, I really struggled with the idea of wanting to fit in. And I kind of got caught up in the wrong crowd, people that weren't living their life to honor the Lord. And it started to rub off on me because bad company corrupts good character. But that was something that I needed to learn. And I ended up flipping somebody off over Snapchat, and they screenshotted it and sent it to my mother. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not the biggest deal of what I could have done in high school. But my mom saw a heart problem with that, and she corrected it immediately. She took my smartphone for 7 months. I had a flip phone in high school for 7 months, and she turned me into the deans, and I had to have a meeting with the deans, and I almost got suspended. So that was really a difficult time for me. I was very upset with her, but looking back on it, I'm incredibly grateful for what she did. And I wouldn't be the same person if she had not done that. And she really got me back on the right tracks.
Wow. Yeah.
that.
That's some tough love, but that's what you have to do sometimes.
Absolutely.
We have a question from the audience. I want to it was for Liam, but I think any of the students here at Gordon, the question is, have your scriptural-based worldviews been directly challenged by other students? Which I think goes to this question of sort of peer group that a couple of you touched on. But have you had your biblical faith, your scriptural worldview challenged by other students, your peers, even at Gordon, at college? And how do you navigate that? And any one of you can jump in.
Absolutely. I think coming to Gordon, I've been exposed to a lot more liberal ideology within a Christian campus. And that was really difficult for me to wrestle with. And it's hard when somebody who thinks differently than I do uses scripture to back that up as well. So it's been interesting to try and navigate what really is the truth. And even though they're backing up with scripture, it may not be the truth. So we have to navigate that and have the discernment in that area.
Yeah.
That's excellent.
And I know some of you talked about, or Liam, you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Gabby said. As far as like being confronted about some of my scriptural beliefs, not directly, because I would say I'm not a very confrontational person. I'm somebody who likes to have like dialogue with other people, but indirectly, the very fact that Gordon College is, like Gabby said, they carry there's people who carry a lot of different understandings and come from different religious contexts, some of which are more progressive. And so the very presence of it in a way is challenging because you're engaging with people on a day-to-day basis who don't necessarily think the same way that you do when they see a certain incident. So for instance, when President Lindsay signs a letter in 2014 asking the state of Massachusetts to exempt them from anti-discrimination law on issues of LGBTQ, the same-sex marriage issue in particular, there was a large segment of the population. I mean, I wasn't here at the time, but I heard a lot about it, and I've had conversations with people. There were a lot of people here who interpreted that as bigoted and even unscriptural and in contradiction to how we should be living as a community. There are also a lot of people here who subscribe to a biblical model of what marriage should be and what that should look like in society. So there were tons of those conversations there, and the very fact that that conversation is still happening here does force you to wrestle with questions about LGBT, because it's not just an abstract question. It's something that's very real and very present in our lives because we're interacting with people who even identify on that spectrum. So we're constantly asking ourselves the questions like, is what I believe true? Because it can have real and substantial impacts on how we not only talk about the issue, but how we relate to our peers at school.
So just like your parents didn't shy away from these issues when they were raising you, you're not shying away from them, these tough conversations either with your colleagues there, fellow students at school. If I can bring in Ben Martin. Ben, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you for having me.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks for coming on. I think when you and I chatted, if I see my notes correctly, your parents taught you not to be afraid of liberals, speaking of which. So you were actually homeschooled and your father was in the military. He was a chaplain, if I remember correctly. So I'm grateful for his service. We need chaplains. One thought I had with you is you talked about the importance of, again, that not being afraid to be weird. You were the only homeschool kid in your circle. And you're always the new kid because of sort of the military and always moving. How do you think that helped? being a bit of an outsider from the get-go, how does that help you make your faith stronger or solidify your Christian identity?
Yeah, certainly. I think it helped every way. And there's a phrase in the military. It's a semper gumby, always flexible. And so
I've heard that before. Yeah.
Oh yeah, took that to heart. And obviously when you're 14 and you just move across the country, and it's your third time moving across the country in 8 years at that point, you're sick of it. It sucks. You don't like it, but looking back on it now, those times were absolutely formative to my faith. It taught me a lot of self-confidence, being sure of myself. It says I'm not afraid to be thrust into new situations or into unfamiliar territory, simply because I've grown up in living in unfamiliar territory and such. And yeah, it's absolutely formative to my faith and to who I developed as a person.
One of the sort of the Benda characteristics that I was asking you all about that you talked about is your parents taught you to prepare to make sacrifices, in part because of your father's service to our country, and so him having to be deployed and being away from the family, but also your mom's service as the military spouse back at home with the kids, and also being part of your father's ministry, which ties into the hospitality, which is another one of the Benda characteristics. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, of course. And my father, as was previously mentioned, is a Navy chaplain. So he served both with the Marines and on a ship in San Diego. So he both served on both the blue and green side, so to speak. So he has his ministry with servicemen and women, but my mother on the other side, while my father was deployed, also had her ministry, so to speak. And her ministry, although not official, is still a ministry. She would always have, very regularly have people over, wives of servicemen and friends who were struggling, and was always able to lend a helping hand, watch someone's kid for an afternoon, take someone's dog on a walk, or even tragically go over and comfort the wife and family of some fallen servicemen. She was very, very, very strong and courageous, and definitely modeled. Both my parents definitely modeled the what you should do in tough situations, and to show hospitality for everyone, regardless of whether or not they are of the faith or not. Because there are because in the moment, you're not going to judge someone based upon, or treat them differently based upon whether or not they're Christian. And there are plenty of folks who are in the military who are not particularly ascribed to any certain faith. And the same is true of their spouses. And but end of the day, regardless of your faith tradition or theirs, people tend to seek those who are spiritually strong and of good character to rely upon in tough times. And certainly when your husband or your spouse or your son, daughter, family member is deployed or is injured or whatnot in the line of duty, he or she is definitely looking for help, and more often than not, strong-willed Christian men and women are certainly serve as that pillar to rely upon.
I think that's a great point that you make about the attraction to a strong, authentic, unapologetic faith.
Right.
I continue to believe.
He modeled it.
Yeah, I mean, for your parents to model it, for you to absorb that is so important. I think going forward, on some of these tough issues, like the issues of human sexuality and marriage, that as Christians, if we, joyfully, unapologetically model the truth, stand for the truth, that those who are sort of trapped in the lie right now will eventually, many of them, Lord willing, will come to understand that they're trapped in the lie, and they'll be looking for pretty much the only people left who didn't embrace that lie, who didn't live by that lie. And so I think, even though there's sort of a movement to kind of water down some of the hard truths in an effort to be more evangelistic, that really it's that sharp distinction that the Bible's truths provide to our current society that's going to attract people when they're ready to be attracted, ready for sort of that repenting of turning around.
Absolutely.
Last point that I wanted you to touch on when we spoke, you said that a common thread of the sort of conservative students that you hung out with or that you know now is that they weren't spoiled growing up. Tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, certainly. This is something I put quite a bit of thought into since you asked me, and I've definitely reinforced this idea. So I was asked the question of what makes more, shall I say, liberals children, what makes them bend that way? And since I do not tend to associate with quite as many of them, I can only counter with saying that the only thread that I could recognize among conservative students and more God-fearing students that I know personally and have grown up with and continue to know to this day have been that when they grew up, they all experienced their parents were not willing to cave to their every whim and sort of spoiled them in that regards, which naturally breeds this sort of
Entitlement, yes.
Emphasis of self mentality, which in turn is real detrimental and leads to, in my opinion, more of a what's the word? I guess liberal mindset. It's a poor way to phrase it, but what's the word that comes to mind? So,
yeah, that's a good point. The idea of entitlement. It's so easy for our kids to have that, particularly where we live. In the country, there's a lot of wealth, a lot of academic success and prestige. I was just watching that there's a documentary on the parents who bribed coaches at these Ivy League schools to get their kids in. That pursuit of academia really more as a prestige symbol than any love for knowledge. And I think, especially in this part of the country, Boston is known as the Athens of the New World. And Athena, that goddess of wisdom, is still very much the idol that we oftentimes pursue. But I'll definitely quote you when I have to say no to my kids occasionally on things. I agree with you. We have one more Gordon student, Deborah Cumby, who is also an MFI intern, does a great job working with us. Deborah, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Great.
So when I was going through the questions, I picked out two that stood out the most to me. And the first one was prepare to make great sacrifices for the great good. My father is a minister and my mom studied philosophy in college. And so I can definitely say that she and my dad both, but particularly my mom, since she homeschooled me and my siblings, really created a desire in me for knowledge. And she sacrificed tons of her time and energy in making sure that we all not only learn things, but desire to learn things. So she cultivated in me the desire to constantly read. I'm an obsessive reader. And the conversations that we had at the dinner table, they never were about, oh, what was just your day like? No, it was theology and philosophy and history and literature. And just talking with, and I was told to constantly be talking with adults. So I never just talked with my peers. And that really helped me to not only diversify my speech patterns, my articulation with other people, but it also helped me to really embrace the idea that we are a pluralistic society, that we need to interact with other people. And we also need to realize that we all come from different backgrounds and different modes of thought, but there is a way to assert the truth within those modes without compromising. And the second thing that I would say that my parents really cultivated was practicing hospitality and serving others. Being in the ministry, of course, you could say that my dad definitely ministered to lots and lots of people, but my mom as his helpmate really exemplified that as well. They both would constantly show us and tell us how to fill a need when we saw it, whether it be washing dishes because no one was doing it at fellowship, or making sure we were the ones to host the youth group events. just seeing a need and filling it quietly actually demonstrates a real love for Christ, but also a love for your neighbor. So I would say those are my two things.
Thank you.
That's great.
That's good. Yeah, as I'm hearing you, all of you students talk, just a reminder that the kids are always watching, you're always modeling, whether you're intentionally trying to model something or not.
And I'm hearing too that the parents were fully intellectually engaged in every area. And I think that's so huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's encouraging.
Well, good. So Gordon students, thank you. Please stay with us. I know there'll be probably some more questions. We're actually going to switch to Liberty University. We've got a couple of students there. Chloe Stubblebine, your oldest, and a friend of hers, Vittorio, I'm not going to say it right, Vittoria Diadesi.
Yes.
Are you ladies with us?
Yeah, we're here. Hi.
Great. Well, I'm glad to have you on as well. And I know both of you are very sort of passionate about God's truth, particularly in these tough areas where it's under siege by our culture. Tell us, what does your families do to get you to where you are now, people who are young and confident in their faith and doing things about it, which I want to ask you about as we go along here.
Do you want to go first? Or do we go first? You can go first.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. So it's nice to be with you all tonight. Thank you for having me. I would say that, I'm very blessed because I actually come from a family that has, for generations, stood up for biblical truth. I remember from the time I was really young, my mom and my grandparents always talking about how my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents have always stood for truth. We actually have newspaper articles from the 70s of my great-grandmother actually appearing in City Hall in Philadelphia to stand against making Philadelphia the homosexual capital of the world, because apparently that's something they were trying to do back in the 70s, was to make, the city of brotherly love be this city that was the kind of LGBTQ capital of the world. And, we have those newspaper articles that show my great-grandmother standing up for biblical truth in the government setting, in cultural settings. So it's something that, my grandparents and my parents have always done as well. So I'm very blessed to come from really just this generational legacy of standing up for truth. Specifically in my life, I've been able to witness both of my parents stand up for biblical truth, specifically with different cultural and social political issues. My mother, I think for the past, 9 years, pretty much since President Obama was elected to his second term, that was kind of the breaking point for her. That was the point where she was just like, I can't understand how someone who stands so totally against biblical principles has been elected for the second time with so much support from the evangelical community, because really there should have been zero Christians who voted for President Obama, or really any Democratic candidate pretty much anywhere, because if you really look at the Democratic platform, everything that they stand for goes against Christian values. But anyways, and so I watched her growing up throughout my middle school and high school years, standing up for truth in pretty much every way. She was never afraid to be the mom that went into my public school and spoke to the school board about some liberal policy they were trying to push. She was never afraid to go into my teachers' offices and talk to them about maybe a liberal or progressive book that they wanted us to read in class. And at the time, it was always so embarrassing to be known as the girl whose mom always came in to talk to the teacher. But, looking back, I'm so thankful that she did those things, because, it not only, made a statement to the public school, but it also was such a great example for my sisters and I of, you shouldn't be afraid to stand up for your beliefs, no matter how many other people are not agreeing with you. And then I also have been able to watch my dad. My dad has not been as active in that regard. He wasn't the one going out building a social media platform or, taking videos or going on Fox News. My mom had the opportunity to do all those things. My dad, on the other hand, he is a hand surgeon. And I've watched him live for truth in a lot of different ways, but specifically, he has had the opportunity to use his skill and his talent by going on medical missions trips and leading medical missions trips in other countries and showing people in other nations. Specifically, he's gone to Haiti multiple times and, standing for truth in those areas and showing that, you can be a Christian and be in the medical field, because a lot of people, especially in the Christian community, kind of are subscribing to what we know as the sacred secular split, which I'm sure some of you know, but for maybe those of you who don't, that's kind of the idea that your religion is personal and subjective and needs to stay separated from the rest of culture and the rest of society. And things like science are objective and transcend all of culture and all of society. However, that does not align with a biblical worldview. A biblical worldview, people who hold biblical worldview should see the world all as one, with kind of a holistic view, in that, God created science, God created culture, God created politics. He created all of these things. And so they all need to be in alignment with each other. And so my dad has had the opportunity to say that, I'm a surgeon who I believe that the world was created in 7 days. I believe that, men are men and women are women. And he's had the opportunity to speak to churches about all of these issues and kind of just unite the, secular world with the Christian world. So that was my experience growing up. I know I'm very blessed to have had two really active parents
and
grandparents. Yeah. So it's
Right.
definitely a lot of factors, but
that
intergenerational.
Intergenerational modeling of moral courage, Victoria, is fantastic. And I know in your own life, you've sought to be active, particularly on the life issue, which I understand is a very important issue to you. And as you mentioned, that's one of the clear distinctions between the two major political parties in our nation. One party is radically pro-abortion, infanticide, and the other party is pro-life. What have you done on the pro-life issue? Specifically, I want to ask you about the company I think you started, if Alana explain it to me correctly.
Yes. So the pro-life movement has just always been on my heart. It's been something that I've always been passionate about, something that my sisters and my mom and my grandmothers and pretty much everybody in my family is super passionate about the pro-life movement. I grew up my mom would always bring us to, whether it was like local or national pro-life marches. We were always going to different pro-life galas or pro-life speaking events, things like that. But specifically in January 2019, my family launched the first and the only pro-life fashion brand. A lot of people don't realize that there are over 70 fashion brands that give back to Planned Parenthood, and they're very proud about it. They're very loud about it. A lot of these brands make clothing that says, my body, my choice, things like that. Or they'll give out pins at Fashion Week that say, we stand with Planned Parenthood. And so a lot of those 70 brands, and the list gets bigger every day, but a lot of those brands were places where my sisters and my mom and I loved to shop. And so for us, that was a huge problem because, we can't claim to stand on biblical truth, and we can't claim to fight for the unborn if our other actions are going to contradict those beliefs. And that includes, something as simple and as basic as where you shop.
And that's great, because you can't boycott everything all the time, which is essentially where you feel like you'd have to be at this point. So like Rob and like Liam, you created a parallel new institution with your vision of pro-life vision. I checked out the website. It looks great. They don't have any red sweater vests, but I did like the T-shirt that said, I think I have cute daughters and I'm a big fan of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll order that one.
We're actually going to the Culture of Life fashion show this weekend, so we're very excited. But Victoria, I was wondering if you could speak just for 1 second about the club that you just started on Liberty Campus, which is known as one of the more conservative schools. but you felt a need to start a club to protect truth. Why is that?
Okay, that's kind of a loaded question, but basically, I'm a junior here at Liberty, so I've been here for a little while now, and I think Chloe would agree with this sentiment. We both kind of noticed that there's so much spiritual activity on campus, and a lot of people, you'll go around campus and you'll see people reading their Bibles, see people praying together. But one thing that we noticed was that kind of progressive ideas were slowly creeping on campus, with a lot of people who maybe they are conservative. A lot of students are conservative, but they don't know why. They're only conservative because their parents were conservative. They don't understand that those beliefs are actually rooted in biblical truth. And a lot of these students don't have a biblical worldview that has been developed enough to recognize, where these cultural issues are, the way that we need to respond needs to be based in biblical truth. Specifically, we saw a lot of things with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, which I'm sure all of you know is hugely communist, hugely anti-Christian. And a lot of these Liberty students were like, oh, well, as Christians, we just have to be loving. And of course we believe Black Lives Matter. So we're going to post the black square. We're going to, hold the sign that says Black Lives Matter. And they don't do any deeper research. They don't recognize the fact that there's kind of the whole double standard in that, we have to be loving and we have to be kind, but Black Lives Matter can go do $60 million worth of damage in one city in one night. And that's totally acceptable.
Well, I think, Victoria, I was just going to say, I think it's very important. I'm just so thankful that you're doing this at Liberty, because as we can see with some of these other colleges who started out Christian, once that gatekeeper leaves the gate, in comes the floodgates of liberalism. So you're right now acting as a gatekeeper for Liberty University. So I'm thankful.
That's great.
Keep going.
And on the pro-life, on the juxtaposition between BLM and the pro-life issue as well. BLM promotes sort of the pro-abortion position. And if you really care about racism, that starts in the womb. In Massachusetts, 4 times as many Black babies, 4 times the rate, they're aborted at 4 times the rate of white babies in Massachusetts. So that's the structural racism right there. Chloe, good to have you on. Can you tell us, your mom's right here, but share with us and with her what worked for you? What did your family do that's similar to what the Benda family did, or that sort of really nurtured this faith in you that you've now taken out into the world?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Mr. Beckwith. I would probably say pretty much what everyone else has already said. I also am blessed in the same way as Victoria. We come from very similar, incredible families with conservative values, and we've really been able to see our parents. I've been able to see them be active in several different ways, be active in our church, and when I went to public school all of my life primarily, and I've seen my mom. She's always contacting the principal, and same as your mom, and just not standing silent on those things, which I think is really good. And I also wasn't homeschooled, so I wasn't sheltered too much, which I'm appreciative of, because I've also seen there's a balance with everyone, but I've also seen some homeschoolers that were so sheltered that when they did leave the home and go off to college, they came to Liberty, even they went off the deep end. So we've seen some of everything, but I'm so blessed for my experience. And the public school has really strengthened me when I was in high school, being persecuted for my faith. And I know MFI, you guys helped me start a Bible study and back me up on that, which is amazing. And I'm so thankful for that. And also the dinner tables, having those talks every night about politics, everything we talk about. And they were just really invested in our lives, which is really great. And it's also caused me to really appreciate being here at Liberty, where it is generally more conservative, and it's okay. And you're totally fine and stuff if you voted for Trump and you are conservative and all this stuff, and you're not hated on, which is amazing. But like Victoria said, we have noticed it's not as bad as Gordon at all. And it saddens my heart to hear about some of the things that Gordon is going through at their school with like the woke Christianity. We definitely have some of that here as well. And we're starting to see it everywhere in America. But we've just slowly started to see that, especially this past year with 2020, the whole Black Lives Matter movement and everything. So, and basically our club is acting as like a biblical worldview club, and it's aligning the biblical principles with political principles and connecting them and showing Christians, okay, like here are all of these issues. This is why they are biblical. This is why they align with truth, and why it's important to stay active on.
Yeah, and also too, we've specifically noticed how a lot of people on campus really subscribe to that secular sacred split. In our club, we want to stand against that and say that actually, no, Christians need to be engaged and involved in every area of our culture, in every area of business, in every area of government, whatever. Christians need to be in all of those places, and you have to bring your faith with you to that. You have to bring your worldview with you to those things. So our club is really just focused on talking about really popular social, political issues that are happening in the United States today, going through all the actual facts that are surrounding these issues, and then saying why we as Christians need to take a certain position based on the facts we're presented with and based on biblical truth, and then how we should be responding to these issues.
Well, thanks, Victoria. Very encouraging to hear from all of you students. Keep up the good work. You've got your whole lives ahead of you, and I'm excited to see what God has in store for you. What you'll be doing with those lives.
And continue to stand. You're our last hope for all of these kids. If you don't speak, then who will? So continue to speak up. So it's so encouraging to hear.
Yeah, then I can speak for all the parents and the grandparents watching right now. Very encouraging to hear from you all. So God bless. Thank you for your time. I'm going to bring in our last panelist now, who's a pastor, Pastor Roberto Miranda, who is the lead pastor at Line of Judah Church in Boston. Pastor, you've been on the front lines of, I guess, the culture wars since before I even joined MFI. I think you were the chair or one of the lead spokesmen for the marriage amendment fight, almost 15, 16 years ago now here in Massachusetts. I've been to your church. It's an amazing worship experience. I love your preaching. And again, you're not afraid to tackle these tough issues. And I wanted to speak a little bit with you about chapter 8, which Dreher has titled as Religion as Resistance. On page 151, Dreher talks about the sense of deep inner peace that every Christian he interviewed for his book felt. He said they credited their faith as the solid ground on which they were able to stand firm. On paragraph 2 on page 151, Dreher says, Christians need to have a golden dream, something to live for, conception of hope. You can't simply be against everything bad. You have to be for something good. So how do you, as a pastor with your congregation, how do you communicate God's truth on these hard social issues like abortion, human sexuality, even racism, while presenting it as part of God's design that is good and beautiful, the truth that is, especially the idea of marriage between one man and a woman? Do you find that there is a hunger for these unpopular truths today?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Absolutely. I think we live in the tension, and we speak and minister out of the tension, which I think God himself embodies and the scriptures embody, between grace and love on one side and the justice and righteousness and truth on the other. And, we oscillate between those two opposites, and they're not opposites really, but they're simply complementary in very mysterious ways. And I think the church has to learn to walk that very tense walk of speaking from the truth, speaking the word of God, announcing it without apology, and at the same time embodying, the grace of God, which is not a New Testament thing, by the way. It's an Old Testament thing as well. You see the love of God, but you also see his seriousness. You see his justice and his righteousness, and at the same time also you see his love, his compassion, his tolerance for us as well. And I think the church has to imitate that. We cannot improve on God's methodology. So the church moves in that tension, and we declare the word of God, and we do it, as you say, Andrew, with a posture of grace and of joy, and just in an affirmative sort of way, because I think that the last thing that we want to do is become shrill, become Pharisaic, become rigid. We need to show also the joy of God and the peace of God. I think that's one of the things that I like about Dreher's portrayal of all of these individuals is, the fact that they martyrdom to them also was accompanied by joy, and the strength that they felt in the midst of persecution was accompanied by a certain peace. So they were able to, as one of the characters in his chapter talks about, jumping into the abyss, embracing that martyrdom, and not sort of gritting his teeth and bearing it, but finding that mysterious place of joy within his suffering. I think we do that as well as the church in our time. So I think we must always embody life, and I think that the world is trying to make us and to paint us as people who are just Pharisaic and sort of petrified and harsh and hard and intolerant. But of course, we know that that's simply it's a ploy. It's a way of blackmailing us emotionally. We have to know that love doesn't exclude that joy. It doesn't exclude that grace. It doesn't exclude that kindness. And we have to move between the two of them. We also have to find, that place of love and of peace within, our experience. So I think we need to move in that balance. I think the church has to be beautiful. The church has to be attractive. The church has to be inviting, and people must see that as well. Even as we announce, truth that sometimes makes people feel uncomfortable. If I might speak also, while you get your notes there, I think that we are living in somber times, and we are living in Alana. We are living in times that would lead us to be deeply concerned, and yet at the same time, I insist that we have this guarantee from God that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. And so even as we see the world, going to hell in a handbasket, as they say, even as we see the progressive agenda kind of, going really fast in its own way, we have to retain hope and encouragement. I think the only thing that can vanquish the church is the church itself. If it abandons its identity, if it abandons its message, if it abandons, its identity. Otherwise, I think even as we see all of this stuff happening in America and things going a certain way, that agenda will fall out of its own momentum. It will implode like the communist world imploded. Also, it doesn't have a foundation. It has no truth in it. So sooner or later, whether because of our advocacy and our stance, or just simply because of its own inner bankruptcy, I think that agenda will fall apart, and we just need to stand where we are and stand confidently, stand joyfully, stand in peace, knowing that.
I think you're absolutely right, Pastor. Right now we still have so much freedom and opportunity. I mean, it's a totalitarian force that we're dealing with, but it is that sort of soft totalitarianism that Dreher talks about. No one's getting shipped off to gulags, but you might lose your job. You could be ostracized on social media. That can't be enough to overcome the faith that we're supposed to have. I mean, we should be willing, as the early church martyrs were, as the Christians under communism were, we should be willing to lose our lives or be shipped off to gulags. If that's
America is not Russia. It's not Eastern Europe when the communists took over. America has millions and tens of millions, as was proven in these elections, of people who pray, who love God, who are orthodox in their beliefs, who are resisting the progressive agenda. And that should give us hope. I mean, the whole dialogue between God and or was it? I think it's Abraham. Where not Abraham. Where in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Where he's saying, how many don't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, if there are 50 there, I won't destroy. If there's 10, if there's one, I mean, America has millions and millions of people here. So I think there's a lot of reason also to hope. Not that we're going to put down our guard. We should not become complacent. I think whatever we do to counteract what's going on right now, we have to do it from a posture of confidence. You know, I personally, and I so respect Rod Dreher's thinking. I think he is a prophet. I celebrate his mind in so many ways. And yet I take a little bit of issue with the idea of America being a post-Christian nation. As I say, that doesn't neutralize so many powerful things that he's saying. I think that I'm not ready to give up yet. You know, that mantle in particularly. I think America is in struggle. America is in process. I think this whole thing with the Trump situation, you know, is a moment in time to be, you know, superseded by other events and other situations. God is a complex God. He loves complex drama. And so I think that there's still, even in the midst of all this struggle, there's all this texture that God allows. I think we have every reason to stand firm, to be confident, to be aggressive in our faith, to not give up, to announce the gospel. I think one of the things that the church needs to do is, don't take the orthodox gospel, the aggressive truths of Scripture, and put them, relay them into a small room for discussion after the Sunday service. I think that's what the devil wants us to do. I think we need to announce the truth from the pulpit to the whole congregation in a plenary sort of way. We need to announce truth in a way that is, affirming and aggressive and strong, because we have every reason to believe that if we stand in that truth and we announce it prophetically, that truth will prevail. So I'm very confident, even in the midst of it all.
Could I ask you a question? On that note, I know you have a very diverse church, and I've been there, and I was so encouraged. I love your church, but I just was wondering how you handle the whole Black Lives Matter. And when that whole thing was going on, were you telling your congregation that this is a demonic organization that goes completely contrary to the word of God?
Yeah, I did not use that word. And, the Black Lives Matter wasn't the only issue that I faced. I pastor a mainly immigrant congregation. And so my stance on immigration was extremely controversial to many people in my church, even though I had written a book on immigration and I celebrated, the contributions of Latinos in America and so on and so forth. But my stance is very clear that immigration has to go through the filter of legality, of respect for law, and so on and so forth. Yes, I think the Black Lives Matter as well. I did it sort of in a kind of like flank, through a flank rather than a frontal confrontation, because I thought that was so much more productive. Sometimes I think when you use words like demonic or other words, people shut down and they don't hear what you have to say. I was clear in my stance. I was biblical in my stance. I never participated in any kind of demonstration. I paid a price for it, Black Lives Matter and so on and so forth. I think sometimes, what we have to do is just suck the oxygen out of many of these things and present truth aggressively and affirming. So, I do believe that the whole Black Lives Matter and the whole critical race theory thing is sinister. It is destructive. It is impoverishing. It really betrays the cause of African Americans here in America. It alienates people. It causes a lot of ill will, and so on and so forth. It's anything but conducive to what they are pretending to do. So I've never approved of it. People know my stance. I paint with little dots rather than sometimes, just painting the whole picture in a way. I think it's very clear, where we have stood in all of these issues. I think these things, like everything else, they'll disappear as well. I think we have seen these things come and go, the whole Me Too movement and many other situations like that. What we need to do is just stand clearly, resist, put forth the true truth, so to speak, and then wait for these things to just go their way. I think if we resist, sometimes in Ephesians you talk about in the day of evil, in the evil day you stand. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to stand on that truth of God, publish it affirmatively, and that truth will prevail. So whether it's Black Lives Matter or the gay agenda, so sinister. That is demonic. And I called it that, and I paid the price for it. But, I think we need to, there's so much stuff that I think the church needs to rescue. Something social justice and diversity, unity. All of these things to be rescued by the church.
Well, I've watched you be strong. You kind of built a foundation leading up to this whole BLM stuff, a foundation of strength, and you have not been afraid to talk about politics. And I say that because we're really putting the word politics on biblical issues, but you've been addressing biblical issues from the very beginning. So it makes it very easy to confront these cultural issues when you bring it right back to the Bible and don't use the word politics to silence yourself.
Yes, Alana, you need to nourish, your congregation every day. I think the pastor is called to nourish. You can't wait until the grass is, over your face and head,
right.
Start cutting it. You got to cut it every day. I think, when you preach, it's like, it's like cutting the grass every day. You have to create a sensibility. You have to slowly deposit particles of truth in your congregation every day. You have to make sure that you choose people in your church who will exemplify, the truth of the congregation, that there will be unity of doctrine. And as your congregation is bombarded in subtle, systemic ways from everywhere, a sensibility is created, a dominant sensibility is created in the congregation. Whenever something foreign comes in, tries to come in, there's all kinds of defenses all of a sudden that are mounted to resist it. And that person or that voice, it just stands out like a sore thumb. And I think that's what we need to do. We shouldn't live in the defensive. I think what is happening in America is precisely because the pulpit has abandoned its sacred obligation to announce the truth every time it's functioning, and also our discipleship classes, our teaching of youth, everything. The whole church needs to be unified in one doctrine, one teaching, and it has to be done consistently, day after day after day. Then we won't have to fight these battles.
And Pastor, one of the challenges I know you're facing, and every pastor right now in Massachusetts, is trying to get fully reopened. I was talking to some church leaders this afternoon who are having to turn people away because of the capacity limits. Some good news, just within the last couple of hours, I learned that I guess Minnesota, they were at 50%. That 50% limit's been dropped now, so they don't have the capacity limit. And just within the last hour or two, I got word that the same thing happened in New Hampshire.
Right. Yeah.
So the question I had for you is we're still 50%. I know a lot of pastors kind of struggle with, well, how do we address our relationship with the state or with the city, with the governing authorities? How do we balance that? Because I think going forward, there are likely to be other challenges from the government. There are even greater restrictions on our religious liberty, and sort of if we get to that point where the government commands what God forbids or forbids what God commands. And I think on that latter half, we're kind of already there with church gathering, arguably.
Yeah.
How do we navigate that?
Yeah, I remember something that you wrote. Maybe it was you who wrote it, that letter that we sent to the governor. We are watching. I remember when I read that, I said, man, this is very confrontative. But, I am watching, and I think a lot of pastors are watching. I think we have to monitor situations. Why? I believe that if you don't have to fire a shot, you don't. You monitor things, and you wait. You keep your ammunition. You observe, as Dreher says. You judge, and that means you discern. And then you await the moment of a confrontation, frontal assault. And I think, as a pastor, that is what I'm doing. I think our governor, to a certain degree, his policy has been more enlightened than many other liberal, states. I think he opened up early enough and so on and so forth. And I think he's been somewhat, a little bit more moderate. I want to sort of give a little bit of credit to that. I think before the church enters into a full confrontation, we might wait a little bit longer. My church right now is full to capacity. We've had to add another service. 2 Sundays ago, we had close to 600 people. I'm concerned right now about Easter and what we're going to do. And we're making plans, contingency plans to do that. People are hungry to come back. And, after a certain point, I think that hunger and just the sheer force of life will manifest itself. I think this thing cannot be repressed. I think people they're just anxious to get back to life, and life will prevail. I think if the church keeps doing what it's doing, it stays firm. We opened up May 31st, the first Sunday that we could open, and I told my congregation we will not bow to COVID-19. And I tell you that we are living some of the best moments as a church right now. I mean, in every way, it's been amazing, and I think it often comes after a crucifixion. After I wrote that essay on Trump and my advocacy for him and so on and so forth, all hell broke loose among a certain sector of my congregation. I experienced a minor crucifixion, and there was a moment when I almost doubted myself about what I had done, but just for a brief moment. But I tell you that even though some people left, and I got some ugly emails and so on and so forth, that crucifixion, which I call it that bleeding has produced, as it has in the past in other times also when we've chosen truth over ease, that has produced something extraordinary. Life has just been emerging, vitality, worship, numbers, finances. They have been blessed. And I really believe it's because of that willingness to experience martyrdom, which Dreher speaks about. It was those martyrs in the Eastern European, the Russian church, that I believe truly are responsible for the collapse of communism. And sometimes we are afraid of experiencing martyrdom in our lives. Sometimes the small moments of martyrdom, when we are, as these beautiful students, we're talking about being shunned, experiencing, alienation, being looked at in a curious sort of way, but it's those moments that God sees that glorify him and that put the devil to shame. And it is those moments, I think, where truth then, becomes so much more powerful. And we have to be willing to, experience and live those moments, because out of that then emerges beauty and life and strength and victory. I just wish more of us were willing to do that.
Yeah. Pastor, final question for you as we sort of run out of time from the audience. The question is, as Christians, we have a responsibility to love by standing up for truth. Without truth, beauty and goodness become irrelevant. How do you suggest we address pastors or elders or leaders in the church that get caught up in wokeness or justify some of this false teaching that's coming in from the world? How do you address that within the church in a way that's loving but firm enough to prevent this from spreading? I think with sadness and great respect showing through your words. I think I think it's also true, and even when we confront people in the secular world, whatever, when they see that you don't relish confronting them, that you're not speaking out of some sort of pride, in what you believe, but that you are doing it out of sheer duty and moral, compulsion, and with a certain kind of sadness and regret that you have to be put in that position. I think that breaks people. And I think when we approach our pastors, again, with that truth, I've been approached, by the way, at times in my own life. I haven't liked it. It's been very unpleasant, but it's healed me of a lot of things. There have been moments when my own parishioners have confronted me about different kinds of things. And I've had to just, gulp and then think whether what they're saying is true or not. And, often what has enabled me not to become defensive is when I see that respect that they are addressing me with, and that sense of duty that they're doing it with, and the fact that they are doing it out of love and respect for me and wanting to defend my ministry and to preserve my ministry, that really opens me up a lot. And I think, please don't do that. Anyone, in other words, don't hesitate to speak out that way, but do it in a way, again, that shows that respect, that pain that you experience at being placed in the position of speaking to a father that way, an elder, but don't stop doing that. I think we need that. Pastors need that more than ever. I think we need to be confronters who do so with great humility, and a sense of vulnerability, because there, but for the grace of God, go I.
I think that's really good advice. I think I see so many people today getting so discouraged with their pastors, and they're heartbroken over what they see happening to their churches, and they're leaving.
Yeah.
Rather than loving their pastor enough to truth them, because truth is the most loving thing you can ever do. Yeah. And I just think people are just jumping ship. And what we need to be doing is lovingly and humbly just confronting these issues with the Bible. And
pastors are under great pain. feeling threatened, insecure. It's not easy to go from one church to another. It's not like getting an employee, some other employment. The employment of a pastor is a very rigid, difficult thing. So when you're, we're insecure, and often we're tempted to, we want to keep our position. We want to keep our churches stable. We don't want the church to fall under our regime. So, I so hear their pain, and I'm not in any way, no, there's no triumphalism in me. I know how much pain, some of these pastors are experiencing, and we need to go with that empathy as well, even as we confront and we speak the truth to them.
That's a helpful perspective, sort of convicting for me. We've got to minister to our pastors if we expect them to be able to minister to us, and we definitely need them to. So thank you for your time, Pastor. Thank you to all our panelists, and for those of you at home who have joined us. If you enjoyed this book club and feel that these topics we discussed are important and valuable, we would welcome your support. We need it. We would love to continue this book club series, maybe pick up a new book. We know that voices of truth are being silenced by the cancel culture, and there are other important authors whom we would like to bring in their own words to your own screen. And I'll close with a bit of good news. Last week, I mentioned that I had been called by someone who is facing potentially losing their job if they didn't use the preferred pronouns of a coworker. And I'm happy to say that I introduced her to my good friends at First Liberty, which is one of these national religious freedom legal ministries that MFI works with. And they helped her successfully demand a reasonable accommodation. It's one of the things we talked about in the Q&A session, the separate video from the first Tuesday night. You can see that on our YouTube channel. But that reasonable accommodation that she won means she doesn't have to call a woman sir. That may seem like a small thing, but that would have been a big lie for her to have to say. And she no longer has to live with it because she had the courage to stand up for the truth. And there are many more stories like that. And we invite you to support us at MFI in these efforts to help us continue to defend your family values in Massachusetts. Please visit our website to donate. I'm sure Michael put it in the chat if he hasn't already. That's because you all make our work possible. Now, remember, next week, we will have the book's author, Rod Dreher, on with us live. We'll let him do most of the talking, and we will be taking questions. I'm excited to see what you have to ask him about. Again, I'm Andrew Beckwith, my co-host, Lana Stubblebine with the MFI Book Club. We'll see you next time.